the tree was all covered in green and branches hanging down, so he was really hard to see. But it was the turkey vultures that were circling on this side of the road that made us stop. And he said that he'd walk, and then he'd collapse, and the turkey vultures would circle him. And then he'd get up and walk, and they'd follow him, and then he'd collapse, and they'd circle him. And one of the vultures sat down and watched him. Ooh, can you imagine? I always wonder how many make it.
This is a typical case that we receive here. This individual was found out in the desert by humanitarians. The first step is that this individual would be examined by a forensic pathologist. For cases like this that are pretty much fully skeletonized, they ask the forensic anthropologist here to help assist in figuring out who this individual was.
So of people who were not initially sure who they are, the vast majority of those in southern Arizona are migrants.
More likely Mexicans and Central Americans who are on their way through Arizona.
Perish in the desert.
There's a variety of ways for a body or a bone to be discovered. Border Patrol will find remains. Hikers and hunters and other people who are out enjoying the relatively cool winter months we have here now in February and March.
There was one winter that it seemed like we were getting dry, sun-bleached portions of bone almost every day in the winter. And it just so happened that humanitarian groups were going out often and finding remains.
I think it's just as much the fact that there are more deaths, not just that there are more being found. Prior to 2000, back in the 90s, there was not the intense presence of the Border Patrol. The numbers of Border Patrol increased dramatically in 2007. Then people were forced into more dangerous territory.
Part of the plan was the deterrence. They thought if we put the walls where it was the easiest to cross, they just won't cross because it'll be too dangerous to go to the other areas. But they don't realize how desperate people are.
They were forced into the mountainous territory, and they could not be picked up for days. In other words, prior to 2007, people could walk from the border up to the Arivaca Highway, the road to Arivaca. And they could do that in one day or a day and a half.
For most people, it's a minimum of a week if everything goes well. And if it doesn't go well, it's going to take most people like a couple of weeks. And you can't carry that much water.
About 120 to 150 migrants, foreign nationals, so Mexicans, Central Americans, are dying in the deserts of southern Arizona every year. The desert is so remote, there's so many places for a body to go undetected.
So if somebody isn't found right away or they start to decompose,
the desert can quickly take a recognizable body and turn it unrecognizable.
People will eventually become skeletal remains, and we see basically the whole spectrum.
Clearly this individual's not complete. We have no arms, we're missing the lower jaw, the mandible, we're missing part of the leg, we're missing some ribs, and some vertebra too. So that's also very, very common for us, that we don't get 100% of the individual. We look for different characteristics that might help identify them. We look at ancestry, we look at sex, height, age, and we kind of build what we call a biological profile. So this individual is kind of fitting that migrant who's coming from Central America or Mexico. We see shovel-shaped incisors in people of Asian ancestry as well as Native American. So you can see that it's kind of scooped out here. So we will take measurements of both the cranium and the different long bones. So a lot of those measurements we can use calipers, and those measurements are going to be able to tell us a couple of things often. Whether or not that individual was more likely male or female. This individual is biologically appears to be male. This is kind of a short little rectangle, and it's usually more extended in an individual who's female. We can also look at the cranium, and this individual has a nice, fairly large brow ridge, which is more indicative of male. This projection here is the mastoid process. So this is where a lot of muscles are going to attach, and it's pretty prominent. Again, that's more indicative of a individual who's male. The femur is the leg bones in general are really good for stature estimation. For this individual with the state he came to our office, I would say he was probably in the desert from about 3 to 9 months. For every individual that comes to our office, we will cut a DNA sample, and we're going to cut that from the back of the femur. This is actually what I would use to cut a DNA sample. So it's just a special saw that is capable of cutting into bone. So even though we can cut a sample of this individual's DNA and send that out, that's only one half of the puzzle, right? So we have the individual's DNA kind of profile, and we need to get a family side.
Most of our DNA identifications for this group of people are direct comparisons to family members or people that we believe are family members to see if they're related.
Over the last 20 years, we've had 3,000 cases that we believe unauthorized border crossings. We've identified 2,000 of those 3,000. And of those 2,000 identifications, about 15%, 350, 400 of those have been through DNA. There are a lot of other ways to identify somebody: fingerprints, facial features, tattoos, dental records, medical records.
We basically build a kind of a picture of what, the information that we have, and then we try to compare that information against missing persons reports if there are any available.
So DNA is not even the most common way for us to identify. Many times it's the only way for us to identify somebody.
We work with the foreign consulates in Tucson. We also work with the Colibri Center for Human Rights. We work for the Argentinian anthropological team. And all of these groups, all of these agencies are able to meet with families who have missing loved ones who they think have disappeared somewhere along the border as they're crossing into the United States. And we can hopefully use that family reference side and compare it to our individuals and hopefully get a match.
The availability of information through social media and through these governmental databases like NamUs has kept these older cases not only in the public eye, but they've resurrected some of those cases that people long ago thought we'll never have any chance to identify this person. As long as those people, those typically family members, don't give up and they still ask questions and they still expect answers. If they still expect answers, it wouldn't be unusual for a case from 5 years ago or 15 years ago for me to be notified today that we now have a lead to the identification.